May we now invite IPS Director, Mr. Janadas Devan, to introduce the session, and Dr. Vivien Balakrishnan, Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our next speaker for the traditional concluding segment, a speech and dialogue, is Dr. Vivien Balakrishnan. Unlike previous guest of honors for this segment, who only come in about 15 minutes before the segment is due to go on, Minister Vivien has been here almost the entire day from early this morning. So he has set an impossibly high standard. So I'm afraid you have set an impossibly high standard for your colleagues. I can give you the usual litany, beginning with the fact that Minister Vivien was a President Scholar. He was a champion school debater, some of you may remember that, and an ophthalmologist by training. He has served in a number of ministries since entering politics in 2001, I think, in MND, in the old MICA, MTI, the old MCYS, MUA, and now, of course, since 2015 in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All this you know as you do that he is also the minister in charge of the Smart Nation Initiative. But let me tell you one thing that not many of you here know or may know. Minister Vivien's hobby is taking apart and putting together watches. I'm not kidding. He likes taking them apart, these intricate timepieces, and then putting them back together. I have no idea why this is a thrilling experience. I know this, for I have had occasion to buy him or get him old timepieces from overseas. But when you think about it, it is difficult to imagine a more apt hobby for a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. For our place in the world does depend on every little thing that we do fitting in with everything else. Just as a watch wouldn't work if the whole caboodle doesn't work together. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I invite our guest of honor, Dr. Vivien Balakrishnan, the watchmaker, as Foreign Minister.
Well, thank you, Janadas, for that introduction, slightly unconventional introduction. Let me first say, I've sat through today. You've had a history lesson from Professor Wang, politics from George Yeo, economics, and then you had a session from Marty and from Bilahari on regional diplomacy. I'm going to try, and I say try because you're all very long-suffering and have been here for many hours, but I'm going to try to synthesize all these elements into a coherent concept. And if you ignore the rest of my speech, I only ask you to remember 3 phrases. The first phrase is a fractured world order. The second, fractious domestic politics. And third, digital disruption. And what I'm going to attempt to show today is a chain of causality between these 3 elements. Let me start by stating the obvious. We live in a very uncertain, volatile, and difficult world. You've heard in the course of the day the strategic tensions, and I say strategic tensions between China and the US, and I would include Russia. You've also heard, or you'd be aware, that politics as we know it is over. In fact, mainstream politicians all over the world are in trouble, and we are witnessing the simultaneous rise of both right-wing and left-wing populism all over the world, not just in the West. You're also aware, deeply aware, that there is deep anxiety the world over, and especially amongst the middle class, over wage stagnation, and over the future of jobs. We are also painfully aware that there is anger over increasing inequality. And if that isn't enough, I would also hasten to add that the level of carbon dioxide in our air, more than 400 parts per million. The last time the world had carbon dioxide at this level was at least 400,000 years ago. And since I'm a doctor, I can tell you we are overdue for the next pandemic. So, having put you all in a good mood, my thesis today is that we are witnessing a fractured world order due to fractious domestic politics that is caused by a digital disruption. Okay? A chain of causality. So let me restate this chain. I believe that technology is a key driving force of human progress. And the early masters of technology accumulate and wield outsized power, financial, political, and ultimately military. Hence, every time the world experiences a major technological breakthrough, there will always be, by definition, revolutionary shifts in the economic means of power. And when you get changes in the means of economic production, that in turn will disrupt societies, change politics. And in turn, that will alter the global balance of power. We've seen all this before. And it's just that it is about to be replayed, but at a faster pace and by different actors. Let me start with the Industrial Revolution to give you some empirical evidence. We speak English today because the Industrial Revolution started in England. Savary and Newcomen invented the steam engine, and this was later improved by James Watt. And the steam engine replaced human and animal labor with energy from fossil fuels. First time in human history. What this meant was the age of mechanization. It uprooted the economy. Previously, handcrafted products were now mass-produced. And, importantly, owning capital became far more lucrative than just owning land. And it transformed agrarian societies. And bear in mind that human beings have had agricultural societies for 8,000 years. In turn, now that you've got machines and you've got factories, you now need labor, and labor migrated to urban centers. You had urbanization and cities. Importantly, in the political field, power structures shifted from landowners in feudal societies to the owners of capital in industrial capitalist societies. And if you think about the way labor was exploited in the early phase of the Industrial Revolution, and the vicissitudes of work and the impact of losing a job in those days, that in turn generated a social and political backlash. And that's why, in fact, we have today's trade unions and even the welfare state in Europe. These were, in a sense, a political response to the last industrial revolution. And this is how the modern political order, with right wings and left wings, emerged. Massive socio-economic disruption driven by the advent of mechanized production. What did this mean for foreign policy in an industrial age? Industrial Britain needed raw materials, a lot of which were from Southeast Asia, and it needed new markets for its new manufactured products. It sent expeditions. Its navy was strengthened. Outposts were established, including exactly 200 years ago to today, Raffles landed in Singapore to establish an outpost. The outcome of this trade and foreign policy was an empire on which the sun never set, and preeminence for Great Britain for more than a century. What happened after that? The next breakthrough was the concept of a moving assembly line. And the archetypical example of that happened in the US, Henry Ford's Model T car. Mass production was made possible through task specialization, and what used to take 12 hours, a car could now be constructed in Ford's factory in 2.5 hours. What this meant was that prices of cars fell, a virtuous cycle was set up between mass production and mass consumption, because those same workers that Henry Ford employed, who earned higher wages, could now become consumers in their own right. And so we witnessed capital accumulating, wealth accumulating even more than before. And those of you who are interested in history will know that there was a period called the Gilded Age. And there were robber barons who found ways to further enrich themselves, and in fact, it was a period of increasing inequality. Across the globe, reactionary responses to this type of very asymmetric capital accumulation led to growing extremism. Fascists on the right, communists on the left. Economic rivalry and political miscalculation sowed the seeds for the two world wars of the last century. The corollary in foreign policy was that the US, at the end of the last World War, having outdone all others in technological superiority, was actually the undisputed main winner of the Second World War and became a global superpower. Yes, I know there was a distraction for more than 50 years with the Cold War, but in a sense, there was no question that it was the US that had technological supremacy, and therefore we should not have been surprised with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The share of the US GDP in the 50s and 60s, the share of global GDP of the US was probably around 40%. Today, although the US GDP has continued to grow, on a relative scale, it is now about 24%. And you realize that when a single superpower has 40% of global GDP, every dollar created in the world, 40 cents accumulates to its account. In that scenario, it was worth its while for the US to set the rules of global engagement, to be the primary architect and underwriter of the world order as we know it, that has existed since the end of the Second World War. This was a system defined by free markets, free trade, and global economic integration. Along the way, the United Nations was formed, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the Marshall Plan for Europe, the reconstruction of Japan. Domestically, the GI Bill, which provided mass education to returning veterans. Mass education that gave them the skills to harvest the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. And there was therefore a golden age for capitalism for about 30 to 35 years after the end of that war. An age of a rising middle class, decreasing inequality, and the average job in America could get people a house, a home, and the security to provide for their families. The foundations of the rules-based multilateral system in fact gave newly independent countries like Singapore a small seat at the table, but significant opportunities. Think about the process of globalization that occurred after the war. Again, it was driven by technological revolution. Names like William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, these were the inventors of the transistor in 1947. But actually, it is Dick Morley's programmable logic controller which revolutionized industrial control because it made it easier to reprogram machinery in factories to change products in accordance to consumer needs. And now that production was easily adjusted, by leveraging on improvements in shipping, logistics, and in particular the icon there is the container and the container ship. And at the same time, the explosion in Infocom's technology transformed the world once again. At its zenith, it allowed for just-in-time production. It allowed global supply chains to be constructed. And multinational corporations became a formidable force and very often having revenues exceeding that of small countries. Now, think about Singapore's position in the mid-60s when we were unexpectedly thrust into independence. Fortunately, our early leaders chose to do what was unfashionable in the early post-colonial era by inviting these same MNCs that were building global supply chains to bring their technology and access to markets to us. This was unconventional back in the 60s. If you think about other countries, newly independent, they were focused on import substitution. So, paradoxically, because Singapore lost its hinterland, and because we had to invite the MNCs, we became a global city way before the word globalization became fashionable. We moved up the value chain subsequently, advanced manufacturing, and ultimately global services. Our GDP grew from US $500 per capita in 1965 to more than 50,000 US dollars 53 years later. As Dr. Goh Keng Swee said, and this was a point which I think Kai Fong made earlier this morning, we needed the humility to learn, the courage to be unconventional, and the ability to unify and carry our people as we were embarked on this journey. Today, the success of Singapore is a living testament to the fruits of an export-oriented free market capitalist system. And we have fully exploited our improved air, sea, and digital links in an increasingly connected world. But the point is this: we were in the right time, right place, right technology, right strategy. And it is always important, therefore, to understand that we cannot engage in navel gazing, but we need to understand what is happening around us and then adjust our posture. Now, whilst the net impact of globalization has clearly been positive for Singapore, in a sense, actually, we had no choice. But nevertheless, we must be careful not to overstate the benefits of globalization. The political reality is that in globalization, automation, there will always be both winners and losers. For Singapore, as a relatively young country, we started from a low base. We made a quantum leap up due to the visionary political leadership that we had. So we are clear winners in this age of globalization. But in the Western world, especially in the last 30 years, it is clear that a significant number of people, especially blue-collar workers, have been left behind. Blue-collar workers in Europe and in the West have seen their wages stagnate, jobs move overseas, income gaps widen, versus the elite, and they are feeling increasingly aggrieved. In a sense, another upheaval, another backlash, and we should not have been surprised by it. Now, to make things even more complicated, we have not yet digested the full consequences of the last industrial revolution. Well, now a new digital revolution is upon us. And this time, I'm referring to smart technology. And in particular, smart technology based on machine learning, a phenomena which actually has only really taken off in the last 2 or 3 years. Machine learning, if you're a biologist, you will say, well, they tried to copy the brain. Multiple layers of synapses, simple on their own, but by having connections and the ability to adjust the strength of connections, you create systems that are able to recognize patterns. But this would not have been possible without the exponential rise in computing power, networks, big data, and the new algorithms. And I want to say, as a biologist, as a doctor, that pattern recognition is the difference between AI, smart AI, and standard automation. Because if you think about it, the ability to recognize patterns is the basis for vision, for listening, for speaking, for translation, and for cognition. Examples, everyone's heard about Google developing the program called AlphaGo, which beat a human professional Go player called Mr. Lee Sedol without any handicaps in 2016 for the first time. I often find that Western audiences who have not played the game of Go do not appreciate just how complex Go is. There are more combinations of moves in a game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. What that means is that unlike chess or even Sudoku, it cannot be solved with standard rules-based programming. And let me tell you, since PM has programmed a Sudoku solver in C and I translate it into JavaScript, I can attest that Go is a completely different level of complexity. So the point now is that for the first time in human history, not only has energy, human and animal energy, been replaced by fossil fuels, not only have automation and globalization taken over, but now the advent of robotics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence are already revolutionizing finance, commerce, defense, logistics, health, and transport sectors. Now, just to give you an idea of how much progress has occurred in the last 2 years, because this is something even I was not aware of. In 2016, the United Nations unloaded about 800,000 documents onto the internet. The critical feature of that unload was that the UN has 6 official languages. So it unloaded documents which were translated word for word by humans in 6 different languages. In 2016, at the same time that Google was playing Go, it decided to use the same techniques of machine learning to do translation. Any one of you who has used Google Translate before 2016 and today will know that there is a big difference. If you don't believe me, try it now. And the big difference was they shifted over to machine learning, neural nets, and pattern recognition. So the point is this, and when Google did it, they didn't tell anybody. They kept it a secret until a Japanese researcher in November of that year suddenly noticed that Google Translate had improved. And then they revealed their secret sauce. And in fact, they stopped all their development using old techniques and switched over to machine learning. Now, there's another explosion occurring, and that's in 5G technology. And I don't mean just the contest between the US and China. 5G will create unprecedented levels of connectivity. It'll increase bandwidth. It will explode the Internet of Things. And there will be an explosion, a tsunami of data. Now think about this point. Pattern recognition using machine learning depends on data. And when you now have a tsunami of data, and you have the algorithms and the computing power and the networks to deal with it, you are sitting on a real revolutionary technology. And language barriers will erode. And you know, it's like today, George scolding the agency for using a single language on a memorial. Well, today, if you just take a Google Translate, you point at it, it'll pick whatever language you want, it'll translate it for you. There's no excuse for us to be monolingual in today's smart world. But herein lies another problem. It means that you are now competing not only with workers overseas, not only with machines locally, but that telepresence is now multilingual. There are only about 1 billion people who speak English to a sufficient level to perform useful technical work today. But once you break these barriers of language, you can easily double or triple that number. So the point is, we are going to see disrupted societies, fractious politics, and the global order as we know it is going to change. In fact, there will be considerable dislocation because the change is accelerating. And in the example I gave you, I bet most people in this room are not even aware of how much has changed in just the last 2 years. And if history is a guide, every time you get a change like this, you get an initial gilded age, greater inequality, robber barons, the early masters and adopters of technology. And it takes time before the new means of production are democratized and a new middle class can arise. I believe we are now in a new digital gilded age. There are winners and there are losers. The winners are the supranational tech companies, you know their names, Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook, which are growing in political, economic clout. Why? Because they sit on top of mountains of specific and very often personal data. And there will be losers, those who have not been able to scale up and have lost their jobs due to disruptive changes. Automation in the past took away many blue-collar jobs. But pattern recognition of today and tomorrow will make many white-collar jobs redundant. It is true that new jobs will be created, but my worry is that they will not be created fast enough to replace the old jobs, and this will cause further dislocation and fractious domestic politics. And so we are already seeing the political effects. Increasing polarization, a hollowing out of the center, of the middle class, and of mainstream politics. So you see that in virtually all societies, one group is moving further to the right, channeling frustration towards immigrants and free trade. They want to build walls. Another group is moving further to the left, demanding increased subsidies, the ultimate example of which is universal basic income, and they want radical redistribution. Can you see it? A collapse of the center, a rise of the right and left. And this breakdown of domestic political consensus will inevitably disrupt the international system. There will be countries that are afraid of change and fearing competition will question the value of the current liberal world order. On the other hand, nations like Singapore believe that we need to master the new technologies, face competition head-on, double down on interdependence, integration, openness, and to seek win-win cooperation. This division and divergence will grow more acute as technological adoption accelerates. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is our current predicament. If you now use the US and China as a case in point, China's achievements in the last 40 years since 改革开放, reform and opening, have been astounding. It has lifted 800 million people out of poverty since 1990. GDP per capita in China has risen from $90 in 1960 to over $8,000 in 2016. China has climbed up the technological value chain. Today, you all hear of companies like Tencent, Alibaba, and Huawei. And this is not just catch-up industrialization. This is pursuing leading, bleeding, cutting-edge technology. In this period, the earlier period, the US and China had a mutually beneficial and interdependent relationship, very different from the relationship between the US and Russia during the Cold War. Instead, you had US companies flocking to China, and actually China became part of their global supply chain. The US also welcomed Chinese investments and Chinese talent into the universities and into their companies. Trade in goods and services reached over US 700 billion per annum. But we all know today the nature of relations is now shifting from engagement to strategic competition. And the question is, why? China used the last 4 decades to catch up, and today is in a position to seriously contest for technological supremacy. And the question then is, who will master smart technology, AI, robotics, and big data first? Who will be better able to acquire and apply